The 5th generation Corvette, or C5, is an incredible sports car value. Despite its age, it actually stacks up pretty well to modern sports cars. But just because it's a bargain doesn't automatically mean the C5 will stand up to continued abuse on track. So, what does it take to turn a sports car bargain into a reliable track car? Let's find out. Hey everyone, this is H&L. I'm going to take some time here and go through my C5 Corvette build log. Let's get right into it. The starting point for me was a bone stock 2004 C5 Z06. I picked this thing up in March of 2020. At the time it had around 27,000 miles. The direction I did go when I started to mod it was actually to keep it pretty basic. Fresh fluids in the engine, transmission differential. Brakes, that was a big focus area before I started my first season of tracking the car. Took apart the calipers, put new seals in, removed the dust boots. I didn't want dust boots burning up and melting on track. Put new rotors on, new pads. Went with EBC yellow stuff, stainless steel brake lines, Modal RBF 600 fluid. I felt that was a pretty solid first track day setup with the C5. In addition, suspension-wise, I had picked up some used Bilson B8 shocks, as well as some adjustable sway bar end links. Having those adjustable end links allowed suspension guy to essentially set the car up neutral, so there was no preload in the suspension. The car came with almost new Nitto NT05 200 treadwear tire. Those actually turned out to be a pretty solid starter tire for track days. The whole mindset here initially, try to minimize the costs, focus on seat time, get out there and just experience it. Just see what it was like to get the car on track, which I did in May of 2021. It was awesome. It was everything I always thought it was going to be, and I was pumped. Just in that first weekend, I learned a whole bunch. The stock seats basically left my head just completely pegged into the headliner. Not fun. In addition to that, I was sliding around like crazy. I pretty much the whole weekend had like a death grip on the steering wheel. It was pretty clear that the seats weren't great. Not only did I not fit, I ended up sliding all over the place. Another item that was problematic, the shifter actually turned out to be pretty sloppy, and that led to a number of missed shifts. And lastly, oil temps actually got into the low 270s, which I was not excited about, knowing that it was only May in Virginia, and it was going to get quite a bit hotter as the summer went on, and I was already seeing temps creeping up there. Between my first and second events, I went ahead and started to take care of some of these mods. I picked up a used MGW shifter. For the seats, options for the C5 are actually pretty limited. It's a pretty narrow cabin in the C5, and because I'm tall, I ended up needing the shoulder belt pass-throughs to be up relatively high, and it was pretty much down to OMP HDE R400s. For the mounts, you can see a little bit of the aluminum mount there on the floor. I went with AMT ultra low fixed mounts. It got the seat pretty much as low as possible in the car, and it absolutely got me the headroom I needed with my helmet on. Here's a look at essentially what the finished upgraded interior looked like. The other elements of this whole kind of like seats and safety package was the Schroth belt. In addition to the harnesses, I got the Brakehouse harness bar. I also installed an improved racing oil cooler and an improved racing oil pan baffle kit. It attaches to the block just above the oil filter housing. I think I have the 200 Fahrenheit thermostat, so it allows engine oil temperature to build a bit under normal street driving conditions. There's also a little side clip here of the mounting mechanism to the lower radiator bracket, and then a little bit you can see there that I went also with a DeWitt's aluminum radiator. In addition, I swapped out the EBC yellow stuff pads. They, like I mentioned, just really were not up to the task of slowing a C5 Corvette down consistently from 140-ish miles an hour at over and over again at VIR. I ended up going with Carbotech pads. I did a staggered setup, XP10s up front and XP8s in the back. The next event I got out to, it was in July. That second event, tons of fun. Learned a lot. All the mods I had done performed really well. Probably the biggest difference being held in place by the fixed seat. It made just a tremendous night and day difference in terms of how I felt in the car. I was able to push myself harder, push the car harder, being properly positioned and properly held in place inside the car. So I ended up with issues this time throwing some transmission temperature warnings. It was July now in Virginia. It was getting a bit hotter. and I was pushing the car harder, as well as some issues with the front brake. Essentially, one of the front rotors cooling down after the last session. I was kind of getting things ready with the trailer, and I just heard a really loud ping from a few feet away. I go over and look, and there's this nice big crack in the inexpensive blank that I had bought from the front. Went with some K&S DBA blanks. I also tossed on a set of DRM brake ducts. This setup with the Carbotech pads, the K&S DBA blanks, and the DRM ducts, it worked pretty well for the rest of the season. Out at Carolina Motorsports Park, a track which is notoriously hard on brakes, also ended up being hard on tires for me as well. My instructor and I, we heard a really loud bang from the front of the car, front driver's side of the car. We thought it maybe hit some debris, so we pulled it right into the pits. We spent the next 45 minutes or so looking the car over. We kept jacking corners of the car up, popping wheels off, inspecting everything we could to try to see, had something broken, had something come loose. What was that noise we had heard? No luck. We didn't find anything. Everything looked fine. After lunch, I took the car out and I found out what the source of the bang was. First flying lap, I ended up losing air pressure in the driver front tire. Going into the kink at Carolina Motorsports Park, which is essentially the fastest turn on the course. It was my first time solo on track, and it was also my first time having some kind of failure. So I was able to keep the car neutral, keep my inputs neutral, put a couple wheels off. It was quite an intense moment. Once I got into the pits and my heart rate had gotten back to normal, I started to look the car over and noticed a divot, a little indentation in the sidewall of the tire, and that's essentially what's pictured here. It's circled. It's very, very tiny. You can see essentially like the lip of the wheel in that circled area just has a little bit of gap to the sidewall of the tire. That ended up being what you see on the right here. The bead of the tire had essentially snapped. That was a pretty crazy experience, and ultimately it started me down a path looking for tires now, and I was able to track down some Nitto NTO1s. I also found a pair of 18-inch by 10.5-inch Z06 replica wheels to match the rear wheels that I had already. This allowed me to run 18-inch tires on all four corners of the car. I went essentially in that first season from novice to intermediate. I still had instructors riding in the car with me, and it kind of seemed like each event kind of uncovered new faults in the car, more pace, more problems, right? So I made the decision as I went into the off season, I was going to address any major issues that I thought could pop up in the second season. That first season, I had spent a lot of time out in the garage installing mods kind of during the track season in between events. I spent the fall essentially researching and planning the mods that I was going to do, and then in early January 2022 I finally got the car up in the air, and for what would be 4 months of work to improve the brakes, the suspension, and engine reliability of the car before I started my second season. So once I got the car up in the air, the first thing I did, take all the control arms off, disassemble the suspension. After that, I went after a weeping seal on the differential that I had on the driver's side of the diff that has some oil coming out. So I went after that, took that apart. In addition to that, I replaced the differential mount, went with an AMT double barrel diff mount. Once I got done with that, I moved on to replacing a whole bunch of components in the suspension. I tracked down some used C6 ZR1 uprights. These are units where the brake caliper mounting arms are a bit beefier than what came on the C5, and there are some reports of under heavy track use with aftermarket calipers, the stock C5 uprights have the brake mounting tabs either crack or shear off. So I wanted to not deal with that, so I went with the C6 ZR1 units. The bushings in the control arms, I went with Borg Motorsports Delrin bushings. In addition to the new uprights, I put in SKF race hubs with ARP studs. For the lower shock mount on the rear control arms, I went with Energy Suspension polyurethane bushings. And for the shock top mounts, I went with Doug Rippey Motorsports polyurethane. The last thing I did on both the uprights and the control arms, I used GM original ball joints in it and replaced all of those. So this photo here, I've got the rear suspension back together. You can see it a little bit. What I'm highlighting here essentially is that I put spec Corvette T1 sway bars in, both front and rear. You can also see some of the oil lines, the cooling lines for the trans and diff fluid from the Doug Rippey Motorsports kit. I didn't have pictures of the install, but you can get a little glimpse of it there. The other picture here is the AMT Motorsports front locking camber mount. I also have some of those in the rear. Just makes life a little easier once you set your get your suspension dialed in. You don't really have to worry about the eccentric turning on you like the circular factory unit would. So once I got the suspension completed, I then moved on to engine disassembly. One of the kind of key things I was going to try to do here as I tore things apart was get the cradle out, the front cradle removed, get the steering rack out, and then put the cradle back up so I could do some work to the front of the motor, the crank pulley specifically. So on the left here, this is just pulling the intake and exhaust manifolds off. On the right, after the water pump came out, I started to hook some chains up to the engine harness, which is a unit that I'm showing here now on screen. It's a piece of red piece that sits above the motor. That then allowed me to pop off the front pulley, the front of the motor. One of the key points of coming in was to put the K-Tech C5R timing chain in, as well as an LS2 timing chain damper. The stock LS6 did not come with a damper, so I took the time to tear the front of the motor off, put the new chain in, put the damper in. While I was putting things back together, I also put in a Melling 10-295 high pressure oil pump. As the front cover went back together, I ended up putting on an ATI super damper. I pinned the crank and then used a big old ARP fastener to hold it all down. After that was done, I then took the heads off. You can see here on the right, I'm disassembling the heads. Went ahead and I cleaned the pistons, took care of the mounting surface on the block that the head was going to, head gasket and head were going to go down on. Went ahead then and had a machine shop clean up the cylinder heads. When I put the cylinder heads back on, I went with kind of a mix of stock and aftermarket parts. What I've got here shown on the left, I've got stock LS3 valve springs. I also installed some Manton push rods, 5/16 inch with a 118 thousandth wall. And then the tip, the little red tip there you see touching the rocker arms, that's 40 thousandths oil restricting tip. So by doing this, in addition to installing lifter trays that have drain holes drilled into them, kind of a big portion of what I was trying to do here was help with oil control. Well, we're still talking about engine internals. Almost completely forgot. One of the whole points of taking the heads off was to replace the lifters, the stock LS6 lifters. They're okay, but they have been known to fail. Some folks go ahead and put in LS7 lifters from the newer Z06 motor. I went ahead and went with Johnson 2110 lifters. After I got the top of the motor together, I dropped the front cradle again. This time I pulled the oil pan off, and I took the time to install an improved racing crank scraper. This is all in the name of oil control. It helps to get excess oil off of the rotating assembly. While I was in there, I also installed a pickup brace to where the pickup tube inserts into the oil pump. As I put the top end back together, I started to install things like my catch can assembly. In addition, here I've got the K-Tech pulley for the serpentine belt. This unit is really kind of meant to help keep the belt from skipping off of the pulley. The stock one didn't really have that nice edge to it to kind of keep the pulley in place. On the left here, a few things of note. I deleted the air system. Generally, that emissions control system takes up a lot of room, kind of in kind of a cramped part of the engine bay right near the exhaust manifolds. It just, to do things like change spark plugs, I just thought it would be easier to get rid of it. And there's a line here, a braided AN line. That's for the accumulator. It's heading up to the front plug in the block for the oil gallery. I will later show a picture of the accumulator setup, and then there's a little red piece there down toward the bottom. You can see that's the AMT motor mount that I installed. Here's the accumulator setup. I went with the 3-quart unit mounted in the driver's side fender well. The trigger that I have, it's hooked up to the ignition. That way when I turn the ignition, any stored oil under pressure in the unit is released to the engine before I crank it over, so I get pre-oiling. And then if I'm on track, the pressure inside the accumulator essentially fluctuates with the engine oil pressure, goes up and down as the engine oil pressure goes up and down. If for some reason the pickup were starved and the oil pressure dropped, this adds a reserve volume of oil. And there's actually a pretty cool Moroso video that I can link to that shows how this works. On the left here, while I had things apart, I took my power steering pump, shipped it off to Turn 1. I had them do an upgrade to their HP2 performance pump. I also installed the Turn 1 pulley on the front of it. But while this work was going on, I managed to track down a set of used CCW wheels. They were 18 by 10 inches wide. They were in a little bit of rough shape, so I took them to a wheel shop. They cleaned them up and did a clear powder coat on them. I mounted up the Nitto NTO1s and had those all set for the season. In the brake department, I went ahead, installed an AP Racing front kit. This is a 4-piston kit. It's got some nice, on the right there, you can see some nice thick 20 millimeter pads. It's the same size as the original 325 millimeter rotor, but it's a 2-piece floating rotor setup. And then lastly, I went ahead and replaced the brake master cylinder. That's it being bench bled. It was an original unit in the car, and it being old and me on track pushing the car to its limits, I didn't want to risk failure of the master cylinder, so I went ahead and replaced it. In April, from January to April, the car was up in the air. I was doing all this work. I went ahead and got the car on the ground, started doing some test drives, did some shakedown runs, and everything went smoothly. I got the car out to David Farmer Racing out in Concord, North Carolina, and he got the suspension dialed in. This time I went with a more track-focused setup as opposed to the kind of dual-purpose street track that I went with in season 1. And I think this handled quite well. It was noticeably grippier out there for a whole host of reasons. But I was very, very happy with how the car performed out at the first couple events of the season. On the left here, you see I killed the Nitto NTO1s I had up in front. They were used tires. I got 5 days out of them, and they were relatively cheap. I then made a decision. I will switch over to Takeoff Slicks. So, Season 3. As of right now, I don't have anything set. I have a few ideas of what I might do. Track spec hood vents. Also looking at possibly doing a rear brake upgrade. I'm thinking next year of running time trial, specifically time trial 3 would be the class. To do that, I have to get some weight out of the car. I'd also have to get the car tuned. I'd probably be looking to tune out some power. With that said, that's the journey thus far. My driving skill has picked up. As the driving skill picked up, I pushed the car harder. I uncovered some issues with them. I addressed them as they came along. In general, I didn't have trouble during the second season. I haven't had to have the car up in the air. I pull it in after an event, and it just sits, hangs out until the next one, which is what I wanted. I didn't want to have to spend time either at the track scrambling to fix the car or in the weeks between events. I didn't want to have to spend my off time scrambling to get new mods done to the car. So in that regard, yeah, the work from last off season went pretty well, and I'm glad to see that it's paid off. So if you liked this video, if you enjoy this content, if you want to see more of it, leave a like, subscribe. And yeah, I want to say thank you for taking the time to watch this, and I hope to see you out on track next time. This is H&L. Thanks for watching.